Good evening. My name is Joseph Sivitz. I'm here for another Saturday Night Story with SJCPL. And tonight, I'm back in black here after our foray into the Western stories. And as such, I'll be reading from the Penguin Book of the Dead, a library book. And the chapter I'll be excerpting is from, it's called Old Ghosts, New Laws, and it involves the 13th century conversion of Iceland from paganism to Christianity. And in it, you'll find there's a interesting way of banishing ghosts, not one I've heard before, which is to take them to court for trespassing and have them banished. I guess that could work. We'll see. Here we go. The farm at Frodriver had a large living room with a bed closet behind it, as was usual in those days. In front of the living room, there were two storerooms on either side of the door, one for dried fish and one for flour. They used to have a great fire burning in the living room every evening, and people would sit beside it for hours on end before they would have their evening meal. The evening the corpse bearers came back from burying Thorgunna, the people at Frodriver were sitting by the fireside when they saw a half moon appear on the paneled wall. Everyone could see it. The moon kept circling around the room, backing from left to right, and stayed in sight as long as people remained at the fire. Thorod asked Thorir Woodleg what it meant, and Thorir said it was a fatal moon. There'll be deaths here, he added. It went on like this for a whole week. Every evening, the same weird moon appeared in the living room. The next thing to happen was that the shepherd came home one day badly shaken. He had little to say, but when he did speak, he was very ill tempered. He avoided other people and kept muttering to himself, so everyone thought he must be bewitched. This went on for some time. When 2 weeks of winter had passed, he came home one evening and went straight to bed and lay down. The next morning, when people went to see him, they found him dead. He was buried at the church there, and not long afterward, massive hauntings began at the place. One night, Thor Woodleg went out to the privy to relieve himself, and when he was on his way back to the house, he saw the shepherd standing in front of the door. Thor tried to get inside, but the shepherd barred his way. Thor began walking away, but the shepherd came after him, picked him up, and threw him hard against the door. This gave Thor a nasty shock and a good many bruises, and he struggled back to bed. Later he became ill, then died, and was buried in the church there. After that, the pair of them, Thor Woodleg and the shepherd, were often seen together. As you might expect, people were terrified. After Thor's death, one of Thorod's farmhands fell ill. He lay in bed for 3 days, and then he died. This was just about the beginning of Advent, but in those days, people in Iceland didn't observe the fast. After all the feast of the guests went home, and the place seemed rather dull without them. In the evening, after the guests had gone, the fire in the living room was lit as usual, and soon it was ablaze. Thorod and his companions came in, and all of them were soaking wet. They sat down at the fire and began squeezing the water out of their clothes. No sooner had they taken their seats when Thor Woodleg and his 6 companions came into the room, all of them covered with earth. They started shaking dirt out of their clothes and throwing mud at Thor and his men. The people ran out of the room, as you might expect, and that evening had nothing. The evening they had to do without light, heating stones, and everything else the fire provided. The next evening they lit a fire in another room, hoping the dead men would not come there, but things turned out otherwise. Everything happened just as before, and both parties came to sit by the fire. On a third evening, Jartan suggested that they should light a large fire in the living room and another fire in a separate room for the household, so that he tried that. As it turned out, Thord and the other dead men came and sat at the large fire, while the living sat at the smaller one, and so it continued throughout the Christmas season. It was Candlemas Eve when they came to Frodriver, and the fire had just been lit. Thurid had been taken with the same illness as those who had died. Jartan went straight into the living room and saw Thorod and the other dead people sitting by the fire as usual. He pulled down the canopy from Thorgana's bed, plucked a brand from the fire, and went out and burned the ashes, all the bed furnishings that had once belonged to Thorgana. Next, Jartan summoned Thord Woodleg, and Thord the cat summoned Thorod for trespassing on home and robbing people of life and health. All the dead ones at the fire were summoned in the same way. Then the door court was held and charges made, and the proper procedure of ordinary law courts was observed throughout. The jury was appointed, testimony was taken, and the cases were summed up and referred for judgment. A sentence was passed on Thor Woodleg, and he rose to his feet. I sat here as long as people would let me, he said, and then he went out through the other door where the court was not being held. After that, sentence was passed on the shepherd, and he stood up. I'll go now, he said. It seems I should have gone sooner. When Thorgrima, Witchface, heard her sentence, she stood up too. I stayed as long as you would let me, she said. So they were all sentenced one after another, and as they were sentenced, they got up and made some such remark and left the room. It was clear that none of them wanted to go. Thorod was the last to be sentenced. When he heard his judgment, he stood up. There's no peace here, he said. We'd best be all on our way. And with all that, he walked out. Then Jartan and the others went back inside, and the priest carried holy water and the sacred relics to every corner of the house. The next day, he sang all the prayers and celebrated Mass with great solemnity, and there was no more dead people haunting Frodriver after that. Thurid began to improve and got well again. In the spring, after all these strange events, Jartan engaged new servants. He farmed at Frodriver for a long time, and people thought him a very courageous man. Good night.